everyone. Welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 126 of the PetroNerds podcast. And as always, I am super pumped for this podcast and especially for this introduction. I apologize that this is a day late. We are actually, we were supposed to drop this on, or it's a weekend late. We were supposed to drop this on Friday in February. It is this episode 126. Today is Saturday, February 22nd, 2025. And this podcast and the meat of what you're going to hear today is a long way to drop of, I promise you, a still very, very relevant conversation and deep dive. So this is geopolitics, oil, and the economy post-election. And this is the, hour-long conversation, hour-long talk and presentation I gave in Midland at SPE to a phenomenal and sold out crowd. I was so impressed with the audience, and they were completely dialed in. We had a accounting group, and we had the Society for Petroleum Engineers. It was really awesome. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I'm going to timestamp this because there is, I always say there's a lot going on in the market, but this is kind of like death by fire hose. I mean, there's really so much taking place in geopolitics and the global economy in the first month of the Trump administration, and the market's having a hard time with it. And I say that by the stock market is having a hard time with it. So I'm going to tell you, walk you through the things that I think are the most important. I try to think in these introductions, how to get you up to speed, and there's literally just so much. So I'm going to try to make this more conversational and think about. I just gave a talk to EnergyNet Efficient Markets, who is also the sponsor of this podcast. That's a perfect little drop there. I was actually supposed to do this recording and intro when I was in Oklahoma City this week, talking to Efficient Markets and EnergyNet and Chris Atherton and his entire team, but I had a technical snafu. But I spent time talking with them in an internal group and had an hour and a half, and I ended up spending a lot of time talking about some things I'm going to summarize today, which is this volatility in oil prices, what's going on with Russia, and this meeting that we had in this sort of opening salvo for peace talks, and then everything with the Fed. So there is a great deal going on with the Federal Reserve, what is being said, what's not being said, the Fed minutes that came out, and all these lingering inflation, which is inflation, the read that came out from January, which is pre-Trump administration, and then all the talk from the Fed about future inflation from the Trump administration because of policies. And that's not getting the market coverage that it needs, probably because the market analysts are afraid to talk and they didn't give this much coverage in the past. So it's just really important. So I'm going to say that, look, this podcast is, again, episode 126. It is Saturday, February 22nd, 2025. This podcast is sponsored by Efficient Markets, also known as EnergyNet. Can't thank them enough for their sponsorship. Was super pumped to be out in Oklahoma this past week to meet with them. But right now, oil prices we are seeing that last night at the close was $70.25. Now, tomorrow's Sunday, and we'll have Asian markets open, and we will see prices start moving around. But we are seeing WTI at $70.25. We're seeing Brent at $74.43. We're seeing Henry Hub at $4.26. We've had a nice move up in Henry Hub. And we're seeing Dutch TTF, natural gas prices. And we're going to talk about these because it's all really important in terms of what's going on with the global economy, and not enough attention is being paid to what's happening in energy prices. But Dutch TTF, the European natural gas prices, dollars per MMBTU on the same metric as Henry Hub, is $14.48. Now that has moved down considerably from $17.58 just on February 6th, or earlier, just several days ago, we saw $17.58. So it's moved down considerably, and it moved down actually on these talks, the talks with Russia, or these talks with Russia and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. So it moved down on that. I think that is way ahead of your skis. I mean, holy crap, you're having one talk and you're actually moving natural gas prices down, thinking that you're going to get natural gas from Russia into Europe via pipeline, the pipelines that were sabotaged probably by Russia. So we'll talk about that in a second, but I think that's way over its skis. We are also seeing the 10-year yield move lower. This is something I talked to when I gave this presentation this week. Something I'm showing and talking to a lot of clients about is the 10-year yield and that correlation or non-correlation with oil prices and what that means. Whether your 10-year yield's going up for the right reasons and oil prices going up for the right reasons, and they're going up because everything's great, or if they're separating because things are bad, or if they're separating because the themes are bad. And right now we're seeing the 10-year yield at 4.431%. So that's moved down a little, and that's because people are moving into the 10-year yield as a safe haven for treasuries, because we've seen a massive sell-off in the stock market. So the Dow was down 700 points on Friday, and we're starting to see these sell-offs more. I would say that they're a little just more, they're coming about a little bit more right here and there. We need them absolutely, because we'll talk about Walmart in a second. Walmart was part of the sell-off reasons on Thursday that lingered into Friday, in addition to on top of retail sales. But the 30-year mortgage, which tracks with that 10-year yield, also has moved down. So with that little recent tick down in the 10-year yield at less than 4.5%, we're now just under 7% for the 30-year mortgage. I think if any one of us was to go and get a mortgage, doesn't matter if your credit score 650 or 850, I think you're going to be paying north of 7%. And that is why you're not seeing a lot of mortgage originations and not seeing a lot of movement on the housing side. So I'm going to start with this of just saying, trying to keep this relatively short and sweet, but I want to spend a little time trying to dissect the economy and front load this. I talk about the economy a lot to clients, and I talk a lot about the data and how the data is not healthy. And you will see, I listened to was listening to Bloomberg surveillance and catching up on economic stuff, and I was watching the stock market this week when I was in Oklahoma, and you are definitely seeing this nervousness and consternation come out into the market a little bit more than just more readily than it was. And I think DeepSeek was a big moment where we talked about where DeepSeek came out and it basically throttled the entire market, right? It sent stocks lower because or maybe we haven't talked about it and I've talked about it with other folks, but DeepSeek comes out, they come out with their AI model. This is a Chinese AI chatbot, and it tanks the market because one, they said that it was built for $6 million and it was done in 2 months. Neither of those are probably true. We have no idea how quickly it was built. We don't know how much money it was for. And the Chinese are not going to tell you the truth. They're most definitely lying about that. It could be hundreds of millions. It could be nothing. That doesn't really matter. The point is actually that it is Chinese and that it's actually competitive against Chat GPT and other artificial intelligence and other chat things. And what it actually does is that you can actually see what it's, the way it's doing it, and that in just a day, it was the number one downloaded app. It also, you've already seen South Korea ban this app completely because of the data that it's pulling in from it. And there are serious security concerns because all this data is actually going back to the company and to China, which actually just happens to be ByteDance. So I think the fact that DeepSeek has a 29-year-old hedge fund guy that there's only one photo of means that it's definitely not a 29-year-old hedge fund guy. This is just a government-run company. But the fact that the market sold off, and that's my point here, the market sold off, they needed a reason to sell off. The market is way too high. And I think you can really see that if you're looking at Walmart and you're thinking, oh, this might be a time to buy. They just increased their dividend. Well, Walmart went down, not massively, but it's definitely down and helped bring the market down. I listened to the earnings call. I didn't feel the same angst, right? They just didn't have the same growth trajectory. They still talk about the single digit inflation in food, right? And especially when egg prices, they said eggs, they said bacon, and they said ground beef. So these are things people want to eat, right? They're protein sources, especially eggs that used to be really cheap. You could buy a dozen eggs for a few dollars. The bird flu is obviously impacting that. There was a point last week or a couple weeks ago where you go to a restaurant and they would give you like one egg. Doesn't matter how much you're paying because they had an egg shortage. So there's a lot going on in that space. But Walmart, and I'm saying DeepSeek, the market is looking for reasons to sell off, right? And that's telling you that, and I'm trying to correlate the stock market back with oil prices and what's going on, because we're seeing oil prices go down to $70. Now, on Thursday, they were 72 and change. They were almost 73. So I think you're seeing decent volatility in the trading of oil. I do not think, as I mentioned, that there's a lot of algorithmic trading going on. I do not think that traders are deeply aware of all the things happening in the global economy. The entire global economy, the U.S. economy, and what's going on with the Fed, what's going on with all these things, what's going on with Russia, Saudi Arabia, you name it. So there's a lot of moving parts there. And so this, we'll come back to this, the stock market and the Fed a little bit, and talking about inflation. But I'm going to want to talk about the meeting in Saudi Arabia with Russia and the U.S. And so this was not with Donald Trump, and this was not with Vladimir Putin. This was Marco Rubio and Sergey Lavrov, if I'm saying that correctly, folks within, so they're head folks. I believe Hexas was also there. So you have leading people, and you don't have everybody in place for the Trump team. So you have to keep that in mind if you're listening to Ukraine Cast or BBC Cast or BBC talks on this and everything, trying to get up to speed to what's actually going on. They do mention this. And so you don't have all the people in place in a month in the Trump administration to actually, everyone's not there. So What's really interesting, though, is I was catching up on this Russia thing to really just, I want to talk about this a little bit. And I was listening to Bloomberg Surveillance, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Bassett, he was also there, and he is talking about this. So there's a lot of interplay with everything going on globally and what's going on in the U.S. economy and what's going on with Trump policies, and also in energy, because that has a lot to do with it. So we have Rubio, the Secretary of State, meeting with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia and Russia. I think it's important to realize that Saudi Arabia was hosting this. So as much as people like to comment and say the Saudis are not willing to add barrels back to the market, or the Saudis are not on side of the US, I think that's pretty incorrect. What we've actually seen since Trump has been elected and he's been into office is that the Saudis, you've seen the oil minister, you've seen their energy minister, really around Davos time and at Davos on the sidelines in interviews, whether it's Bloomberg or CNBC, say that we have a few million barrels a day and we can easily bring those back. I think easily a couple million barrels a day can probably come back. So they're saying that, right? They've kind of set that out there. The fact that they've hosted this meeting means that they're in that. Oddly enough, they're interested I think not oddly enough, they're actually interested in stability in the market, right? So clearly, if the Saudis are hosting this, that's a nod to the U.S. saying, look, we're hosting this meeting for you. We're willing to be an independent party. And the fact that they're competing with market share with Russia is really serious, right? It means that the Saudis have lost market share to China and India, because a lot of this crude, most of the crude has just moved from that was going into Europe and other places, and some actually in the US, has just moved largely to India and China. So both countries are taking over 2 million barrels a day of Russian crude at a discount. Obviously not enough of a discount, or Russia wouldn't have the money to fight this war, and they do. So we really haven't done much on that part. And in the bonus episode that's going to drop with this podcast, so this podcast, you'll hear a lot about this within this complete geopolitical economy oil rip post-election. There's a bonus podcast that's going to drop. Part of this episode 126 is going to drop right after this, and it's a Q&A, and I talk about this in addition to that. So it talks about Iran and sanctions in Russia. So I think what's important to realize is that, so Saudi's hosting this. If we think about this, how this might play out, right? This is just an opening salvo. And I know that there's a lot of stuff that Zelensky has said. There's a lot of stuff that JD Vance has said in Europe that has made folks a little angry in Europe. I don't think JD Vance said anything inappropriate in Europe other than, where are you guys with your policies? I mean, clearly Europe is extremely far left on their policies. They're having massive pushback on immigration policies, but they're really having, honestly, massive pushback on inflation and their green policies. And you're seeing such extreme prices for energy and cost of living and just the ability to do business in Germany. That's what you heard at Davos. That's what you heard over and over and over again, is that nobody can do business. And so when you're seeing people take to the streets like you did all of last year, and farmers in Germany, it's because of inflation. It's because the red tape, the inability to do business, the regulations. And so JD Vance has went over there and said things. Now you hear Bassett talking about this as well, or Secretary of Treasury Bassett mentioned, hey, Vance made these comments. He made it pretty clear where the Trump administration stands. So you're hearing this all over. Well, so the Saudis are hosting this, and So the Saudis are hosting this, and what you're hearing is this, the commentary around this is that the comments from Zelensky, because he's not there. So Zelensky is not there. Ukraine is not represented in this, nor is Europe. So they're not happy about this. So that's what you're hearing, those comments. And then you're hearing Trump make comments as well. And so he's calling for elections within Ukraine. And they're actually, Ukraine Cast does a good job describing this. When you have martial law enacted in Ukraine as a part of law, they don't have elections. Now, we can be very honest that whether it's appropriate for Ukraine to have elections or not, that's one thing. But there's a lot of question marks in terms of what's going, like the reason that Bassett and the Secretary of Treasury is talking about this is from the money side. Now, he makes an argument, which I thought was very interesting, when he's in this interview he just did with Bloomberg. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more how he's talking about energy markets and stuff and his meeting with Powell. But he makes a comment actually about Ukraine. And he said that, he was there and he was meeting with them. And he said that the reason that you're hearing about Trump and you're hearing about minerals in Ukraine, which is what everyone is grabbed onto, is that he said the plan was actually to draw U.S. and Ukraine closer, so that the U.S. had a financial interest in Ukraine that could be sold to the American public, and therefore then the U.S. would have an incentive and interest to actually in protecting Ukraine. That's the logic. You can like it or lump it, but that's where they're going with this. So I think what you've seen was an opening salvo. You heard Rubio say we're at the very, very beginnings. This is very preliminary. I think it was I think it was openly positive that the fact that the two sides even talked to each other. Zelensky has been advocating for a peace deal as well, for a deal. Now, obviously, Zelensky wants Russian troops out of his country. He wants Crimea back. He wants all of his territory back. And clearly, that is not what Putin is going to want to give. This is a peace deal, and this is going to be very messy. And I think what Rubio, when he said, all these pieces have to be in play, and the days following this, I believe this was on Monday of this week. The days following this, I'm not saying it's fallen apart, but I think we are pretty far away from an actual peace deal. So I think that the market impact and implications, and we're kind of seeing this in oil prices, although I think what we're also seeing in oil prices is an overwhelming, a little bit of just a pullback in general, because the market's pulling back. And so the market's anxious and nervous. And so that 10-year yield's coming down, and so is oil prices coming down because they're nervous about the economy, and they're nervous about policies and inflation and everything. So that's what you're actually seeing, I think, with oil. But when we saw natural gas move down in Europe, and the apparently the reasoning was that natural gas prices were moving down because we could have a deal with Russia and Europe, or there would be a peace deal, and therefore Europe would go back to buying natural gas from Russia. That's amazing to me. I mean, I can't believe we didn't hear more leaders. Apparently, these leaders who are so angry about this in Europe that are saying they're not at the table. I can't believe we didn't hear pushback on that. But it is known and very clear that Angela Merkel, when she was in office in Germany, and by the way, Germany's having an election tomorrow. When she was in office, and before she left, she was on the belief, and I think most German leadership was, that this war would end and they would just go back into taking this Russian natural gas because this is cheap and that's what they need. And so, regardless of what their green policies are, so pretty much about face, but that's what they were thinking. So it does make sense to me that you probably have leadership that's saying that as well. If I'm Ukraine, that does not feel very good, because it's probably actually the Russians that sabotage those pipelines, but I don't think it's going to make Ukraine feel very good in terms of where Europe is at actually in this. And so some of the things you've heard and some of the follow-up from this has been talking about U.S. funding and where that's going to actually end up from a military standpoint. So Trump is obviously pushing Europe to spend more on defense. They are spending more on defense, but not nearly what they're committed to. So you were hearing, and again, I'm talking about what CNBC, I'm talking about market coverage and stock market coverage, how this could shake out, is that you could actually see more funding by Poland, which Poland is spending 5% on defense, but you could see more funding by Eastern European countries, and therefore more of a U.S. presence from a military standpoint in these Eastern European countries, which means that Europe has to come up with this funding and this work themselves. So as a result of all this, and also extremely fascinating, is that Macron and Keir Starmer, the leader of Macron, French prime minister, French leader, President Macron of France. They've had like 7 prime ministers in the last several months. So President Macron is coming to the U.S. to meet with Donald Trump. Keir Starmer is also coming to the U.S. This is next week. So both of them are coming in, and both of them are going to be talking about this, because obviously the Europeans are being asked to have a peace role in peace dancing in Ukraine. So that's the up to date on what's going on there. I would say be very cautious of getting a deal immediately. There's a lot of moving parts, and just a lot of talk of everything going right now, and a lot of stuff that's being negotiated. One of our envoys, I think it's Kellogg, that was there in Ukraine just recently this past week, was supposed to have a press conference with Zelensky, and I believe it was the U.S. side that actually canceled that. So clearly the U.S. and Ukraine are not on the same page there, but that wasn't canceled by the Ukrainians, that was canceled by us. So, there's a lot of moving parts, and we don't know a whole lot. So with that, I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk about the Fed and the economy and sort of the stock market sell-off. So we have seen a decent market sell-off. And I apologize for this intro sort of being long-winded, but I think this stuff is really important. And then you're going to get into this awesome deep dive. So I think you're going to be completely up to speed on everything going on. And this should give you bountiful evidence of why you should be working with PetroNerds, or at the very least becoming a sponsorship and partner like Efficient Markets and EnergyNet. So right now, what's going on with the stock market, we have the sell-off. A lot of that is on the back of these concerns about Walmart. I listened to the earnings call. It was not nearly as scary or fearful as actually previous ones had been, when they're talking about higher inflation and higher income consumers, spending at Walmart. Now you're seeing the former CEO talk positively about Walmart and say, hey, if you liked Walmart before, you should like them even more now because they're cheaper. But you're also seeing some concerns and some worriness in retail sales. And where this is really coming from is, if you look at inflation data, and I went through it and I was updating it and looking at it for this talk I was giving to Efficient Markets, is that again, every time I say this, and I say this really seriously, but if you track and you just chart inflation and you chart the Fed funds interest rate, as the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates, you had interest rates come down and you had inflation move back up. And so there's just a direct correlation with that, right? Interest rates have actually moved down a whole 100 basis points, so a whole percent. And the Treasury yields have actually, the 10-year Treasury has moved up in tandem, almost the full amount. And that's because the market is saying, no, we have inflation. And so what the Fed is saying, and this gets really confusing because I think the stock market coverage is exceptionally poor, and they're kind of reiterating it. The Federal Reserve is saying, and they put this out in their Fed minutes, is that they're concerned and echoing concerns about multiple, and Goolsbee and others are talking about this out loud on TV, are saying that Trump policies and tariff policies and immigration policies will be inflationary, and they are concerned about this. So these concerns in their Fed minutes are weighing on their ability to cut interest rates. Well, that's being said now from the Fed minutes from before, which none of these policies had taken place, and he wasn't, he was either just in office or wasn't in office yet in January. So those Fed minutes come out and they throw additional cold water and they say, but that's on inflation, the inflation rate that we had, which was 3%. Inflation had actually ticked up a whole, a decent half a percentage point in some cases. So inflation ticks up. We have got, services are still, the cost of services are still above 4%. Housing is still 4%. Like all these things are still 4%. You're seeing food inflation obviously go up with eggs. And so what you have is the inflation rate from January before Trump was in office, and you have the inflation, or like he's just getting into office. And then you have the Fed minutes coming out worried about inflation from Trump. And this is all weighing into the market. And then you have Fed commentators coming out like Goolsbee or folks on the Fed and saying, we are concerned, if I think he said something to the fact that if Trump policies become like COVID, and it's all these negative headwinds to the market. I mean, the fact that he's likening Trump policies to COVID, that's really, really serious. So the reason I'm mentioning this and why I find it extremely frustrating is that the Fed did not want to talk about, Biden policies or Biden economics or Bidenomics, or he didn't want to talk about the fiscal spending. And when he was asked about this massive trillions of dollars of fiscal spending that even well after COVID that was still being spent in the name of COVID and all these measures and everything, he just basically sidestepped the question and said, we're not going to really address that. And yet now everyone on the Fed is super concerned about these policies. So they haven't yet landed. And I'm not saying that tariff policies cannot be inflationary. They can be one-offs. It really depends on how they're done and how they're implemented and whether or not who takes the bite out of it, right? Is it if a washing machine if the price increases, does it go onto the consumer? Does the consumer buy it? Do we get more washing machine sales in the US? I was just working through the joint report, the Chinese congressional report that comes out. That's an 800-page document. It's massive. I was just going through that from the end of 2024 when they released it. And they were actually talking about washing machine sales, and they were talking about the tariffs that were in place under the first Trump administration and what happened with that. And they said a lot of them they were sort of one time, right? And that's why the Fed looked through them. So the question now is, will the Fed look through this? Are these going to be one time? Are they going to be persistent? And so right now, there's a lot of talk of tariffs, but they have not yet landed. And I say that just to clarify is that there's now talk about tariffs getting implemented for automobiles and for chips and potentially for steel as well, autos, chips, and steel on April 2nd. But we also had a week ago or a couple weeks ago where we're going to have tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And I think it's really important to point out why these tariffs were going to be on Canada and Mexico. There's a massive amount of Chinese investment into Mexico and a massive amount of Chinese goods that comes through Mexico as well as Canada. So part of those tariffs are on, and the reason part of their pause is because Trump is talking to these guys and saying, we don't want this stuff in our country. And what are you going to do to hold this back? You're hearing a lot about the immigration side, but I think a lot of it does have to do with China. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. Well, those were talked about. They were set over the weekend, and then by Monday they're done because Trump is talking to the leader of Mexico and Trudeau in Canada, and there's a pause put on them for 30 days. The one that was implemented was a 10% tariff on China. That was just on top of the already existing tariffs on China. actually included in that was the limitation of getting rid of the de minimis rule. And the de minimis rule, where you're going to get nerdy because it's exceptionally important. The de minimis rule is a rule, an old rule that we've had forever, basically so people could go abroad and send stuff back and not be taxed on it. But it's extremely high in the US. It's actually $800 per day per person. So what China is doing is they're sending in Temu and Shein and all this really crappy goods that are made with forced labor and coal-fired power generation, and they're like $3 for a t-shirt, clearly made with forced labor. They're sending them in through this de minimis rule. They're not taxed and they're not regulated. So what China's doing is they're actually having warehouses where Temu can put all their stuff together, and then they're sending them out individually. So if you're willing to have the wait 2 weeks or whatever it is to get it from China, you can get something at a much cheaper price. So that was implemented, and then the Postal Service said, okay, we're not going to take any packages from China because they get crap tons of them in, and then things got all mess, and they had to pause that, and they're still taking them. So that's getting worked out. I really do want the de minimis rule to be addressed. I want the stuff with China to be addressed. I think this is extremely serious that we're taking in this much Chinese goods that are not even regulated at all. And if you go through that congressional report, you're going to see so much stuff on, baby stuff for children getting poisoned. Just the fact that you don't have on regulations is really huge. And I will say, and I mentioned this before, but this commentary that we're hearing about inflation on tariffs, as I point out, we have to let those land, and those can be inflationary. They're also, Jamie Dimon and others have talked about this. If this is about national security, if there's some good reasons to put this in, those might outweigh the one-time inflation effects. I'm not saying that's always 100% the case, and I'm very concerned about the economy, but you have to keep that in mind. When it comes to immigration and when it comes to the deportations that we are hearing Fed commentary and a lot of analysts and pundits on the stock market talk about, that's really concerning to me, is the fact that you think we have so many illegal immigrants in the workforce, and that if those illegal immigrants are deported back to Mexico or Mexico and other countries south of the border, that we are going to have inflationary impacts from labor. So if you have that many people in your workforce, are they paying taxes? How are they embraced in the workforce? And is that regulated? I think you have massive regulatory issues with that, not just from the fact of maybe being paying under the table in taxes, but there are serious concerns with that. So I think you have lots of externalities and lots of concerns. And that kind of, to me, is something to think about, of unregulated shipments that you're just letting in from China. We wouldn't want that in from any country, let alone a foreign adversary. And lastly, I'm just going to say, and I know this could be a podcast in and of itself, but lastly, I'm just going to point out that Secretary Bessent, who's now the Secretary of the Treasury, he did this great interview on Bloomberg, and he was talking about, they're asking him about tariff policy. They're asking about policies and inflation. And he says, look, the policies of this administration, of the Trump administration, are intended to be anti-inflationary. And he talks directly and specifically about energy and how lowering energy costs are a huge component of this. So I do think this guy's from the private sector. I think I've heard a lot of commentary about Bessent, and he's liked by both sides. He's a intelligent man, so he's well spoken, and I'm looking forward to hearing more things about him. But that's the last thing I'm going to leave you guys with. So this conversation, this talk, this presentation, this podcast, you're in for a treat. This is Geopolitics, Oil, and the Economy post-election. This was recorded in Midland for Society of Petroleum Engineers, SPE, on November 19, 2024. Oil prices at the time were $69 a barrel, not far from what they are right now. So with that, folks, thank you guys so much for listening. Again, this podcast is sponsored by Efficient Markets, and also want to give a shout out to Permian Resources, who sponsored the lunch table that I was sitting at this event, and also ConocoPhillips, who helped sponsor this event and helped me with this with Society for Petroleum Engineers. So thank you so much, folks, and please tune in to the bonus episode that's just an extra for you all, which is a conversation, just a table fireside chat Q&A with folks. So thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Raised in Northwest Colorado and Southwest Wyoming, she grew up around pump jacks and has worked on oil and gas sites in Colorado and Wyoming with her father. With that, please welcome Trisha Curtis. Awesome. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to mic myself up. All right, I am really, really pumped to be with you guys here today. I am really pleased with the turnout, so thank you guys so much for coming.
it's not like we have anything to talk about today, not with oil and gas or the industry or geopolitics. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and if you aren't tuning into the PetroNerds podcast, I think you really should. It's a lot of free market intelligence, so I hope that you do if you haven't tuned in as of late. But we have a lot of ground to cover, so we're starting out with geopolitics, oil, the economy. I'm not going to tell you how many slides I have, nor am I going to tell you how many I deleted, because you might get a little overwhelmed. But you are going to be awake, and you're not going to be falling asleep at lunch, I can promise you that. So we are going to dive into this. So big takeaways, like our big key takeaways here. A lot can happen in a weekend. We saw that Chris Wright was appointed as the U.S. Energy Secretary. Obviously, he has to get confirmed. Yep, huge round of applause for him. I just spent a half an hour on a phone with a reporter talking about why Chris Wright is a great pick for the U.S. Energy Secretary, and there's just like a laundry list. You can't, there's many, many things. So that's really significant, and that really does, when we talk about, I'm going to spend a lot of time referencing this, but I'm talking about tailwinds and headwinds. And something you saw with the Biden administration was a massive shift in energy policy in the U.S. So the Biden administration was the first very anti-domestic oil and gas production administration we have ever had. It's very important to talk about that because it was really serious, and I don't think enough industry executives did talk about that. Chris Wright was one of those folks that actually did. He was a publicly traded company, and he basically told everyone, hey, it's okay that you don't agree with the policies. You can actually have a stance. And I think we've had too many leaders in the oil and gas industry that didn't do that. But when we talk about tailwinds and headwinds, there's a massive shift going on. And so when the Biden administration came in, there was a lot of policies they put in place day one, which put a lot of tailwinds for, say, green tech, whether it's wind power or it's solar power. There was a lot of impetus behind that for electrification. That's shifting now, and you had a lot of headwinds for the oil and gas industry and domestic oil and gas production and activity. Now that's really shifting. In addition to that, over the weekend, we also had the Biden administration approve of using weapons that we have given Ukraine and allowing them to attack inside of Russia. So that has begun. So those are big developments that happened just over the weekend. So we can talk about those, and we'll talk about those in context of what's going on geopolitically. Election implications for energy obviously are massive, as I'm pointing out. Trump really does mean change. And I don't think it would have been as significant, because if we hadn't had the Biden administration, which was a massive change from even the Obama administration. I mean, Biden was very starkly different in terms of the policies from day one. So now that's why we see so many tailwinds and headwinds. And I'm going to reference that a lot, because I think when you think of investment, and I'm not giving you investment advice, I'm not telling you which stocks to buy, I don't have legal capacity to do that. However, I do think in terms of just the trajectory, if you're just looking at stock market, if you're looking at performance, the tailwinds and headwinds when we think of just wind and solar versus, say, in green tech versus oil and gas production activity, that is shifting. And it's going to become okay to invest in oil and gas in the U.S. And we'll talk a lot about that and why leadership for this administration matters. So I think we have to be very honest about saying, people talk about the energy transition, and people are talking about Chris Wright being on the record for saying we don't have an energy transition, nor do we have a climate crisis. He's absolutely correct. We don't have either. And I say it's not an energy transition. People say it's energy addition. And I say it's just energy, folks. And you're going to see it actually in the data that I show you, is that when you add wind and solar into a grid, that doesn't mean you're transitioning. It just means you're adding crappy wind and solar into a grid, and you're increasing the cost of the cost of electricity, and you're decreasing the reliability. And you see that within the data. But it's really about energy. And I say just energy and not energy addition or energy transition, because we're the largest oil and gas producer in the entire world. And so this administration, the Trump administration coming in, because of these policies and this willingness to embrace oil and gas, and putting somebody like Chris Wright, who not because he's from the industry, but because he's deeply intelligent about energy in general, he's one of the few people that can actually go toe-to-toe with me on all these things I'm going to talk about. He knows everything in this slide deck backward and forward, which is just amazing to have somebody like that in Washington that actually understands energy policy, or understands energy so they can make good energy policy. So this administration will have unprecedented energy opportunities in terms of the leverage to leverage what we have in the United States in terms of oil and gas production, but also in terms of how you sanction Iran, how you deal with China, how you lean into more oil and gas production in the US, particularly gas production, how you export more liquefied natural gas. And because we're producing so much, those levers are really, both for up and down, are unprecedented. We also have a strategic petroleum reserve that needs to be refilled. So if prices were to go down too low, there's some levers Trump has with this deep understanding of the industry that can really help with this. And then geopolitics, war, the global economy, all really, really serious, and we're going to talk about that as well, is that geopolitically, we are really in an unprecedented geopolitical state. And I know I talk about this a lot on the podcast. I talk about this with clients. Jamie Dimon, just this past week, was talking about how we are in a very, very complex geopolitical and geoeconomic world, probably the most complex we've seen since World War II. I absolutely agree with him on that point. So this is something that the Trump administration is coming into office at a time where we have a lot of complexities. We have two very, very hot wars going on right now. You don't hear as much right now about what's happening in Israel or how many attacks are happening within the Red Sea by the Houthis, but just Google it. They're ongoing, they're continuous, they're happening all the time, and you have this ongoing war in Ukraine. At the same time, you have a global economy that's absolutely weakening, and that is why we see something like $69 a barrel today, despite the fact that we're allowing Ukraine to use our missiles in Russia. That should have propped up oil prices. It didn't, or didn't really prop them up too much. And we have serious weakness in China, we have serious weakness in Germany, and we kind of have weakness across the globe, and we have a lot of oil production. When you have oil prices north of 60 for several years, you get lots of oil production, and that's what we're seeing right now. So we'll unpack a lot of those. And then the China thread is really, really important because, and I'm not certain about this yet, I really do hope that this administration puts some people on that really do understand China. I'm hoping for some hawkish folks on China, not just because I want hawkish China folks, but because I want somebody who has a sober lens and a sober reality of China, the same as energy, because China is very complex. It's really a big black box. You're not hearing much about China right now, and that's because everybody is so focused on the post-election in the US, but you're going to be hearing a lot about it, and we'll talk about that as well. But there's a thread with China, and that's Iran, North Korea, Russia. So China is funding Russia. They're funding them directly and giving them money, but they're also they're buying their grain, they're buying their coal, they're buying their oil, they're buying their natural gas. So they're really helping them, and they're giving them technology. They're giving them all the technologies that they need, chips, everything that they can't access from the rest of the world, and autos, anything you can think of that you would need to fight a war or not fight a war, they're getting all that from China. And then North Korea and Iran are kind of the thorn in everyone's side. Iran is waging this war against Israel with their multiple proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, and those are being funded with the 2.5 million barrels a day that Iran is exporting to China. They're sending them a lot of money, so Iran has all this money to fund these really unsavory actors who are doing a lot of bad things. And all these countries are kind of colluded together because they have one thing that they have in common, which is they don't like the US or the West. So this is not a good alliance, and there is this thread with China in there. And then lastly, something I'll close on is the awesomeness of what you guys are doing in this space in the US shale sector. Cannot be underscored enough. It is incredible. And when we talk about what a Trump administration and what this means for US domestic energy policy, understanding US shale and what we're likely to see is really important. And we're going to close on that really, really positive note. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Bear with me. I redropped this podcast I did with Chris Wright. I know everybody's probably doing this, but if you want to get to know your energy secretary, this is an hour and a half with Chris Wright a couple years ago. Really awesome talk. There's a new one that's coming out because Jason Isaac and I just were on talking with Chris at his office last week before he was appointed. So that we'll be dropping that as well. But it's really great. So, okay, so new administration, think oil and traditional fuels, and think geopolitics. So absolutely, American oil is back in fashion. And I'm not saying that just because I'm raw oil and gas, which I actually am, because I am third generation oil and gas. But it is actually back in fashion. The world consumes and produces over 100 million barrels per day. The fact that the US is producing 13.5 million barrels per day, the fact that we're just not going to demonize it, that's really huge, right? We're consuming this, we're producing it, and we're the largest oil producer in the world. And I say back in fashion because it becomes investable again. And that is really significant. It's not just investable in that, yay, I want to go buy a publicly traded company. It's that as a nation, if it's more investable, we can bring folks into the US. We can actually bring the capital, but from a private equity standpoint and from a public standpoint, to actually get infrastructure built. And if I could underline one thing over and over and over, it is infrastructure. So the biggest difference between a Biden administration that technically didn't squash oil and gas production, they didn't push or emphasize or embrace infrastructure. So we had the LNG export permit pause in January of this year. Infrastructure is a really critical piece. And that did impact the ability for people actually to get money to build LNG export facilities. And we will talk about that. I'll show you the numbers. We're exporting about 12 to 14 billion cubic feet per day of liquefied natural gas. We could be exporting more. Certainly our nameplate capacity, we could probably ramp that up to 15 BCF a day or 16 BCF a day quickly. But it's really about having redundancy in the pipeline. And I'm going to talk about natural gas and LNG. It's still a new and nascent market. It is not nearly as fluid or it's not as transparent. We don't have the same transaction that we do, say, on crude oil. And so we need to develop that, which means we need more infrastructure and we need to get those molecules on the water. And then I think the other way you can kind of characterize this thinking about the next several years and the differences is that this is really going to be about policymaking about energy prices and the consumer, and less about the energy transition and virtue signaling. So there wasn't anything that we didn't really do. I mean, we've been lowering CO2 emissions in the US, and I'll show you that. But that's largely on the back of natural gas getting into the grid. That's really not about putting wind and solar into your grid, because that hasn't necessarily helped your CO2 emissions. And lowering energy prices for the consumer matters a great deal, because we have very, very high electricity prices right now, which we did not have prior to this administration. So we talked about Iran, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela is another one that has that China thread. Enforcing sanctions on Venezuela is also something that Trump could be able to do, especially if he's able to eke out a little more production out of the US. On Iran, it's really about enforcing these sanctions on Iran and going after the crude oil exports. So Iran, on paper, is probably exporting about 1.8 million barrels per day. That's not true. They're exporting way more than that. They're producing over 3 million barrels per day. They're probably exporting about 2 and change to China alone. And so if that's back of the envelope at $70 to $80 oil, that's several $1 billion a month that they're getting from China. And if we can make that go away, we can make their ability to not just build out nuclear power and the ability to build out a nuclear weapon, but also their ability to fund all these proxy organizations that are doing a lot of damage in the Middle East. So I told you, China is funding and aiding this war with Russia, the war in Ukraine. They're funding Iran. They're aligned and allied with North Korea. And all these entities are aligned and allied against the West and the US. So they're all things that this is the complex geopolitical environment that this new administration has to deal with. This is very serious. If it had been Harris, they would have had to deal with this as well. So no matter what, it's a complex geopolitical environment. And it's complex geoeconomically as well, because we have a globally declining economy. So just to recap, Day one of the Biden administration, he suspended permitting on all federal land. And the reason I'm emphasizing these things is to not rip on all this stuff. It's to say how different these tailwinds and these headwinds are going to be. The market coverage, CNBC, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, has done an exceptionally poor job of covering domestic oil and gas, of covering just traditional fuels. And that's why I'm emphasizing this, because there wasn't not enough coverage of what actually this administration did and why this is going to be so different in the next administration. So day one, there was a suspension of permitting by the acting Secretary of Interior, before we even had a Secretary of Interior, day one to suspend all permits on federal land. People probably in this room had permits that were given to them on January 20th actually revoked. Now, they eventually got those, but this was just a political card that they were playing to try to get people appointed and Senate confirmation and everything. It wasn't legal on tribal lands, but they did it anyway. Day one, they also revoked the Keystone XL permit. This was huge. This was coming out to the market, to the world, and saying, we are not only against oil and gas in America, we're against it in Canada, and we're against we have an alliance with Canada. We get 4 million barrels a day of crude from them. And this administration came in and said, this pipeline that's almost already built, just for looks and for purposes of politics and everything, I'm just going to not give that permit in the name of tackling climate change. So that was virtue signaling. It was all signaling. It was very poor for the market. It was very poor for our relationship with Canada. And even if this was symbolic, I am all for getting this sucker just built. I think redundancy in the pipeline system is great, so I say all for it. And there's really good midstream reasons to do this, but it was technically almost all the way built. And it really did impact jobs on the pipeline side. Day 7, we have a pause on all new oil and gas leases on public land and an emphasis to decarbonize the grid. So this is your big executive order on climate change, 14008. I cannot wait for day 1 for this puppy to get rolled back. Because the emphasis of this is so huge. The fact that you cannot lease new lease sales on federal land, we've had one. We've had one lease sale. It was in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a record lease sale. And it was a record because everyone knew they weren't going to get another one. So that's really huge. So one, we're going to be able to lease on federal land. That's the Biden administration is currently legally obligated to do that. They're just not doing it. And then you take out, when I say the headwinds, you take out the tailwinds that were being pushed for this decarbonization and pushing this wind and solar into the grid and the investment that's going to go behind that. And I'm not just anti that. I'm anti, wind and solar because they are not good forms of energy, right? They come from China. They are produced from coal. They are produced from forced labor. And when they get into the light bulbs, by the time they get into this, we've lost a lot of energy and they are just not very efficient. And I am not all for throwing good money after bad, nor am I for virtue signaling when you're not actually doing anything and lowering CO2 emissions. And I'm not for forced labor in China either. So permits under Biden, this is not an up-to-date chart, but this is what it looked in the first couple years of the Biden administration, where federal land permitting on BLM dropped off a cliff. And so I think you can also expect to see, and this is really important in New Mexico on federal land, this is important for Wyoming, this is important for Alaska, this is important for anywhere with federal land, is that the Bureau of Land Management, they are seeing impacts from the Inflation Reduction Act from the IRA, which does not actually reduce inflation because it's a massive pork spending bill. But that being said, there's things within it for Bureau of Land Management that impact the ability for them to just permit where they have to account for life cycle CO2 emissions. Hopefully pieces of that will get repealed, but I do expect that on federal land, just in general, you're going to see permitting, just normal permitting, which we saw under Obama, which we saw under Trump, which we've never had this decline in permitting except for the Biden administration. We'll see this normalized again. And then your ability, when you have a permit that's expiring on federal land, I think you're going to be able to reapprove that without problem. You've not been able to do that on the Biden administration. So that's really serious. And I say that because, and I've been telling folks at this table, and I've been telling folks and clients and stuff for the past couple weeks, one of the biggest differences is if we have lower oil prices, yeah, that's not fun. You're probably going to have lower prices whether you had Trump or not because we have a global recession. But if I have low oil prices and I have a healthy regulatory environment, I don't have onerous regulations pushing on me, and I have a little bit of prop up in natural gas prices, I can live with that. And I think the industry needs to appreciate that. And the regulatory environment I'm talking about on federal land, that's going to be very good. It's really good for smaller and private operators, I think, as well. So day 30, we rejoined the Paris Climate Accords with the Biden administration. I am very serious about this one, and this is largely symbolic, but I think this does throw out investment signals and is really important. So a reporter was talking to me today about Chris Wright, and I had to throw in this one as well, is that I think pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords is absolutely important. I hope the Trump administration does it on day one, and I hope that it's not just about symbolism, it's that if we pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, it was only one house that did it, so it wasn't fully ratified by Congress. We're not legally bound to it. Trump pulled out, Biden went back in, Trump's gonna pull out again. And I'm not gonna get him on the podcast now because I've been ripping on him, but the CEO of Exxon, Darren Woods, he came out in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm not in favor of this, and I'm just gonna be honest, because I give credit where credit is due, but I will criticize. And when Darren Woods goes to the Wall Street Journal and he says, we shouldn't pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, no, we absolutely should pull the Paris Climate Accords because it allows us, it sends a signal to the world that we are open for investment. We're open for investment for oil and gas here. That not only just helps your share price if you're Exxon or Chevron, that also is a good thing for all companies to access capital, and it gives a signal to the rest of the world that they can lead too, that they don't have to put this crappy wind and solar from China into their grid, that they don't have to force this, and it allows other countries to come with us and say, you know what, we're gonna have rational, sober energy policy. So I think it is very significant and very huge, and it goes beyond symbolism, and it does go to investment. There were a ton of letters that the Biden administration sent. That last one is actually to Darren Woods. It's like he forgot about all this, but that was a letter that he was sent by the Biden administration telling him to pass along the savings of oil and gas to the consumer. We do not see those same letters, and I'm a fan of Exxon, so I'm trying to be joking here, but we have not seen the same letters from the Biden administration to utility companies that are raking in money hand over fist and are not passing along cost savings of very, very low price natural gas. You guys in the Permian are getting, 30 cents, maybe an MCF, if not negative pricing. So we're not seeing that get passed along to the consumer, nor are we hearing outrage by the Biden administration about that price gouging. We will get into that because I think that's super serious. Okay. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that's your red line right there. You can see that the Biden administration tapped into that. It was an amazing piggy bank for the Biden administration. It is not political. A Strategic Petroleum Reserve it's called strategic for a reason. It shouldn't be political. I was on a webinar and giving a talk and presentation with the government last week. And it was interesting because there were a lot of oil analysts that have been around for a long time, and they all said, hey, we can use the SPR to lower prices. And no, we can't. We never were supposed to. You want to have it so you don't have to use it. If you actually need it in a wartime scenario, or if you need it whether we're helping out an ally, you need those stocks there because you don't have to use them. You want to have it to where you don't have to use it. You don't want to be dipping into it just to lower oil prices. And that's exactly what the Biden administration did, was they tapped into it, not because the world didn't have enough oil, but because prices went up because of the war in Ukraine had started. Now we're starting to refill that. That purple line is just oil demand. That's refined product. That's your actual oil demand in the US. It's about 20 million barrels per day. It includes propane, it includes diesel, it includes gasoline. We'll get into that a little bit. But you can see we will really drain that strategic petroleum reserve. We're refilling it. And the options for this administration to refill this is significant. We do need to be refilling it. We need to be intelligent about it. We don't want to do it at $80 oil. That's not when you want to be refilling it. But hey, prices get down to 50. That's probably a good time to talk to the industry to say, you know what, we're going to make sure prices, we're going to keep a floor on prices, and we're going to start refilling the SPR. That's good for America. That's good for the industry. That's good for energy security for the world. So, and then Biden administration, again, this is Biden's actual words. This is the State of the Union in 2023. And I'm emphasizing this point because I say you're going to have to really appreciate the flip and the difference. I don't think the market appreciated or didn't talk about the difference we had from previous administration to this one and now to the next one. This was his State of the Union address where he was ripping on oil and gas companies, including Exxon, for not saying instead they use the profits to buy back their own stock, rewarding CEOs and shareholders. That is what utility companies are doing right now. We don't see him yelling at them. And he talks about climate change as an existential threat. So that's probably one of the single biggest things too when you pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. Not labeling climate change as an existential threat. The ability for, the Biden administration was starting this. When you roll that back a little bit, and I think Chris Wright has some very honest views about, a climate crisis, or the fact that it's not a climate crisis, that climate change is happening, it's happening slowly over time, and understanding that the world is not burning up tomorrow. And actually, if the world was burning up tomorrow, the things that you're trying to implement, which is wind, solar, and batteries, don't work well in extreme temperatures. So those are not the answers. We will talk about that a little bit more as well. And then lastly, we had the liquefied natural gas exports, the pending, pausing pending approvals for LNG. This was on January 26th of this year. This had a huge, huge impact. And you had so many people in New York and so many people in Washington that did this double thing where they basically were, they were very happy that the Biden administration did this. If you read the wording, it's insane. It reads like a stump speech for a 24-year-old activist. And it's insane. It doesn't talk about the content of what they were actually trying to do. This was all about trying to get young voters and trying to get young people who were really pushing the climate agenda. This is what this was about. And yet the people on the market basically said this was no big deal. It's just symbolic. Well, it wasn't symbolic because what happened was that, and this is why I say the symbolism does matter, what happened was they changed the investment immediately. I mean, you look at companies like Tellurian who have not been able to build their actual LNG export facilities because they haven't been able to allocate and get the capital and all the people to the right spot. That can change when you have the ability to say, hey, we are going to be here for the long haul. And the impact to countries in Asia, the impact to Europe was really significant because they questioned, the moment this happened, they questioned whether the US was going to be a long-term supplier of LNG. That's really big because we've spent the past 20 years just telling Japan that we do have the natural gas. They finally believe us that we have the natural gas, and we have hundreds of years of natural gas. And then we do this pause, and then they have to think, well, crap, am I going to be able to get it from the US, or do I have to get it from Qatar now? Do I have to get it from Australia? And if I'm another Asian country and I don't have as much money, I'm thinking coal. Yep, coal is very energy secure. I can dig this up, I can stick it next to my coal-fired power plant, and I don't have to worry about putting this on a fancy ship and turning it back into gas and all this expense. So there was a big thing that this did. It told Asia, you better lean on coal. You told Asia, you better lean on nuclear. And already the fact that the Ursula von der Leyen in the European Union has come out and said, we're ready to buy natural gas. That is post-election, she came out and said, we're ready to buy natural gas from the US. That is this post-election thing that's happening with Donald Trump, is that this symbolism does matter, is that the European Union is ready to sign long-term deals with the US. And that is huge because that means that we can start investing in long-term infrastructure in the US, create that redundancy in the pipeline that we desperately need. I say this in every presentation. It's so funny. So I really encourage you guys to go on the White House website and look up this and zoom in. This is clean energy and the Biden-Harris White House. This is on the White House website. Those are solar panels. So ingot wafers that make those solar panels, even if they made those in the US, the ingot wafers come from China. They come from forced labor. They come from the province of Xinjiang, all made with coal-fired power generation because you need a lot of heat to make the solar panels. So that's what they got behind him. And then they got this white piece of paper with nothing on it that they're staring at right now. Absolutely nothing on it, which is literally the Biden administration's policies on energy, is nothing. Good, you guys are awake, getting some laughs, that's awesome. Okay, so when I say headwinds and tailwinds, I just want to show you that's S&P utilities, so just S&P, their utilities, and you can see the red and how much ramp up, that's the performance they've had under this Biden administration, how flat oil and gas has actually been. Really important to put out just where oil prices are at. When we are hanging at $80 oil, I really do not, and again, I'm not giving you investment advice, but $80 oil, stocks and companies that are exposed to oil and gas have not been properly evaluated. We have not actually properly evaluated because the pressures we've had to this administration, the pressures on the energy transition, the pressures of ESG, all the tailwinds and everything in the world against oil and gas is not allowing for oil and gas to be appropriately evaluated in the market, in the near term, in the medium term, in the long term. And that matters a great deal for just investing in stocks, but that matters a lot for actually investing as well. And then that very, very low natural gas prices you see, that should really, really be a positive for you, the consumer, and businesses being able to buy, being able to actually heat your homes and fuel your homes and manufacture in the world. Okay, so oil prices are absolutely signaling some negative things around the world. So we definitely have global economic weakness. Prices have been under pressure for the better part of this year. You can see that this is the 1-year chart of oil prices, and we can see how the fact that we have these ongoing wars, the fact that we just allowed this missiles to be or weapons from Ukraine to be used within Russia, we should have seen a higher spike in oil prices. So I think this is interesting just to think about for thought exercise. I really do not think $70 oil is it's not a low price. But if we think about we have $70 oil and we have 2 hot wars, how much is that geopolitical risk premium? Maybe it's $10. So maybe real prices are probably $60 a barrel. And I know China is doing really terribly. It's a big black box. You guys don't hear much about China, but it's not doing well. You have to listen to some pretty nerdy, weird, wonky China podcasts to get a handle on how bad they're really doing. They're not doing great. And so that means that we don't have that demand coming from there. We have serious problems within Europe, particularly within Germany. So we know that the global economy just isn't healthy. So that's kind of the backdrop. But if we think about over time, that shows you in the 80s where we were for oil prices and where we're at now. We're actually at a pretty decent level for oil prices. And so I say that to the industry, not because I know it's not great when you have 80, but the global economy cannot take $80 oil right now. And it's very, very healthy. And I care a great deal about the consumer and the ability for people to access affordable and reliable energy. And so $60, $70 oil is much, much healthier for the consumer, and it's much, much healthier for the global economy. If the US is the bright spot in the global economy and we don't go through recession and Trump is able to wrangle this and it's good, having lower oil prices is very, very healthy for the US economy. He's not an idiot. He does know this. We did have very low, pretty low prices under him, under $60 a barrel. But when we saw that, when we saw after Obama and we saw coming out of the recession, we lost a lot of oil demand in the Great Recession in the US. After 2008. So we came out of that, it was low prices and all this production in the US that really spurred the US, Japan, Germany to actually it spurred us to do well because we had this low oil price platform. So if you want to know health for the global economy, low prices are important. If we were to have $80 or $100 oil right now, you were looking at guaranteed recession, death knell for the global economy. So you really can't have it. And that's, we can talk about it offline about where you actually want prices and how you live with that in the environment. But we have serious economic weakness in Europe, across the world, especially in Germany. That's weighing on prices. Germany is very, very tied to China, both for imports and exports. And I'm talking autos and goods, right? So Germany has absolutely doubled down on China. They did not learn their lesson with Russia, and they've decided to just go double down on China. And every day, it seems to be getting worse. They seem to not think they have any other options, but they realize that, so they're not exporting as much goods to China because China's economy has declined and China's dumping products into their country. They allowed for this. And then, so they're getting double hit, and they're just getting decimated from a manufacturing standpoint. And then China's economic weight and its weakness, that's really weighing on this global economy. It's a lot worse than you think. I'll show you some data points in there. It's not good. China is not demanding 17 million barrels a day of crude oil. They might be importing and taking 17 million barrels a day of crude oil total, but they're not using all that. A lot of that's being stockpiled, and I think a lot of that is what you're seeing in the market now. And then the US, we are 20% of the global market, right? So even if we're a bright spot, 20% is not enough to hold up the entire world for oil demand because we're just 20%. And how long we can keep this continuing? Look, I really do think there are a lot of policies of deregulation that are very, very positive under a Trump administration that are positive for the economy. You're seeing that with the stock market, you're seeing everybody get really excited, but we are kind of headlong into recession. That has been staved off because we had this $27 trillion of global economic stimulus that's still sloshing around the global economy that's created so much inflation. But we have serious inflation still in the US. And so we still have these serious pain points. We have very, very high housing prices. We have inflation. The Fed doesn't know what to, they're terrible at their job. So they keep lowering interest rates, but they can't impact the 10-year yield. So the Fed has lowered interest rates 50 basis points. They lowered it again 25 basis points. And they were hoping that, we were going to lower interest rates and then the 10-year yield would move and mortgage rates, the 30-year mortgage would go down. The 10-year yield is what tracks the 30-year mortgage, and the 10-year yield has ripped higher. That is not just because Trump has come in office and they think it's inflationary. That's because the people trading, looking at the world, realize we have sticky inflation, and therefore interest rates need to be higher. So mortgage rates are back above 7%, so the Fed has done absolutely nothing. Okay, so OPEC has extended its cuts till the end of the year. This is really serious because it basically means that Saudi Arabia is producing they're producing under 9 million barrels per day, and they're holding the bag for everyone here. Now, a lot of the signaling you've probably seen from the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, if you turn on the TV a few weeks ago before the election, and you hear the stuff from Saudi Arabia abandoning their $100 price target, they don't have a $100 price target. They have a $100 sort of break-even fiscal price target, and the abandoning was really that they were just gearing up their economy to go, they're knowing that they're gonna have lower oil prices. But they're trying to signal to other OPEC players that, hey, we've been holding the bag and we might not keep holding the bag. They're not really talking directly about the US. I think that's one, they don't intimately understand US oil and gas production, and two, they can't really control it. But they've been holding the bag, they've let Russia continue to produce, and their market share has been eroded by Russia and Iran, which is very serious. If you just type in oil into Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, you will get whiplash because every other article is oil price is going up, oil price is going down, this is why oil price is going up, this is why oil price is going down. It's ridiculous. So there's a lot of things impacting oil prices. The Saudis are one. US control, the ability for us to rein in spending and still produce what we're producing is huge. China demand is huge. What's going on in the Middle East, all huge. Massive, massive factors. And I'll be honest, there's a reason why people pay people like me and people pay me is because this stuff's really hard and there's a million things impacting oil prices right now. But the US has literally changed the geopolitical map when we think about this. And I have a lot of stuff in here and I'm going for this redundancy because I really want you to get it. And I know you guys know this stuff, but it helps to show it a million times. So oil production is in blue there. That's our 13.4 million barrels per day. That red line underneath it is our crude oil imports. So we import about 6 million barrels per day. That purple line is our imports from Canada. So again, our neighbor to the north, which is awesome, 4 million barrels a day from Canada. So there's only 2 million barrels a day that we get from other countries outside of Canada. And then that black line is our crude oil exports. We export the same amount of crude that we import. So we export 4 million barrels a day of just crude. That's really the light sweet stuff that we produce with shale. And then we import the heavy stuff from Canada, and it works out awesome. And it really does mean, getting a pipeline like Keystone XL would have been beneficial because pipeline redundancy is really important. It's not always great for a midstream player because you have to overbuild pipeline capacity, but it's super important when you want to get oil plays off the ground. That's when you think of like gas and when you think of infrastructure. Can't emphasize that enough is when we think of getting that LNG out off the ground, you need that redundancy in pipeline and export. JP Morgan had a note in the Financial Times. I'm not sure a lot of people saw this, but they talked about these missing barrels. They're basically finding more barrels on the market. It really is in line with my thinking of we have a lot of crude on the market. We definitely know that China is stockpiling. And so we probably have a little bit more than people are realizing, and we have plenty of supply. This is the EIA, the Energy Information Administration in the US. This is their outlook for liquid fuel consumption. You can see it's kind of jagged, that it's growing a little bit. But the reality is it's north of 100 million barrels per day. But if we're producing more than that, that's when we have pressure on prices. So the EIA and the IEA are all saying that. OPEC is interesting because OPEC, for the long term, you can't see those numbers. They're bullish. They're basically saying in the future, we're at 103 million barrels a day demand right now. OPEC is saying in the long term, we're going to be consuming 120 to 150 million barrels a day demand in the future. They're always bullish because they have to be. What else are you going to say if you're OPEC? So U.S. household debt, we do have a lot of debt. We have almost $18 trillion of U.S. household debt. That's your mortgage debt. There's a lot of debt there, $12.5 trillion in debt. Now, that little line, everybody says that debt is fine, don't worry about it, because everybody refinanced their house at 3% and everybody's doing great. That's fine, but that little tick up there, and that's not completely fine. Whether I have a 3% mortgage or not, if I've spent too much on my house, it's still expensive. And we have a lot of expensive houses. But that uptick there after the 3% mortgage, those are like your 7% mortgages, and I think those are definitely at risk. And then you have all this other debt that's accumulating from credit cards and auto loans. That gray line there is your uptick in credit card delinquency. So credit card delinquencies are rising. Your average housing price, again, the Fed has done nothing here. Your average housing price just ripped higher. It barely has come down, even with the interest rates rising from the Fed, which means, and I hate to break it to everyone, they didn't raise interest rates high enough. They didn't actually, so they were trying to keep everything perfect, and that's fine, but you didn't lower housing prices, you didn't curb inflation, so they didn't actually do their job. They just kind of kept things rolling. So average housing price is high, your average mortgage size is really, really high, and it's just made it really hard for people to buy a home. And every time they lower interest rates, they're just doing the opposite, and it's not making it easier for people, it's not actually making it easier for people to buy a home. So our vehicle miles traveled and our gasoline demand, getting back to oil, that's our gasoline demand and in black. And you can see where COVID, it came down, and our vehicle miles traveled. A lot of people look at this, and the market likes to look at this and say, oh, look, that's electric vehicles. It's definitely not electric vehicles. And I'll tell you that because electric vehicle sales are just tanking. It's very difficult to actually sell an EV right now because the market is bad for them, because electricity prices are so high, but also because people just don't want them. And the resale for an electric vehicle is atrocious. So the data doesn't compute that that's electric vehicles driving down. Really, it computes that you have a lot of people doing work from home, working remotely. I think that's going to be a thing of the past because it's not really working. The federal government's going to have to get back to work now, so that'll be fun for them. So that means that people are driving, but they didn't drive as much as they did, and then they came back from COVID, and that's really oil prices, right? Oil prices spiked, and then people pulled back, and so we're kind of seeing that in the data. It's important to watch this, though. This is your oil demand, that's your red line of total oil demand, that's oil prices. So you can't really see here, but I point this out because you can see in 2008 when prices ratcheted up, we had the global recession, and you can see oil demand in the US came down considerably. Again, this is why I point out why lower prices are healthy, and you can see when oil demand in red came back, where our oil prices were. They were much lower, and that healthy lower oil prices was really what drove that demand back up. That's jet fuel demand and oil prices. Those are tracking in line. I would expect that as I have flat, stable, lowish oil prices or just stable prices, my jet fuel demand comes back. That's also people not working and people just having flexible, we don't work on Fridays type thing, and a lot of people flying post-COVID. Diesel demand is concerning to me. So diesel demand, it's that tail end. It's not outright declining, but it's soft. And I don't like it because diesel, it tells me a lot about my economy. So part of that's because we had that big spike in oil prices, that curbed it. But then it's overall just general, I think, inflation. But diesel is construction. Diesel is moving stuff via rail. Diesel is truck traffic, and that is concerning. And it does kind of echo with $69 a barrel. U.S. truck tonnage not declining, but it's not rising. It's kind of soft, so that correlates. Federal spending, and I know I'm probably going to go over time, so I'm going to keep ripping through this. So federal spending, we have a lot of federal spending. So we have over $7 trillion in federal spending. We have nearly a $2 trillion federal deficit. Our government interest payments are north of $1 trillion. Huge to point out because this is several $100 billion more than our military spending. This is really, really expensive because when you have a big deficit and you have interest rates, you have to actually, and people say, well, lower interest rates. Your yields and what you get for that are reflective of that. So like you have to drive up the interest rate for people to incentivize them to take on your debt. So this is a nerdy chart. We can talk about this later, but that's just your 10-year yield and WTI and what's actually happening. Right now we're seeing the 10-year yield move higher. We're seeing WTI move lower. And that's telling you a lot with the economy, right? It's telling you that we're kind of betting that there's some softness in the global economy, and we're betting a little more bullish on the US, but also that the US is not having the deflation or the lower inflation that people thought. So I care about inflation a lot, if you can't tell, but this is a nerdy chart and fun. WTI is in green there. The federal fund interest rate, this is not updated for the latest read, but it's right in line. That's your Fed funds interest rate in black. And then that's your purple line is your unemployment, and that orange line is inflation. Now, orange line actually ticked up, so there's a little notch up that actually ticked up in the last inflation read from last week. But you can clearly see that the Fed didn't raise interest rates enough. And so yes, inflation has come down, but inflation is way above what it was previously. And you can also see that we have had bouts of very, very high oil prices where we did not have inflation. And now we have higher-ish oil prices and we have inflation, and that is a problem. And that's really a problem because it's so frustrating to listen to the news and the market, and they're like, hey, headline inflation is down, it's only 2-point-something%. When you strip out food, energy, and shelter. Well, that's cool, because food, energy, and shelter is everything. I mean, that's what people are living off of. So shelter is actually at almost 5%. It actually moved up on the inflation read. Services, to what you pay people, that is almost 5% still. That's hanging in there. Electricity is 4.5%, and food away from home is still 3.8%. So if you just want to live, eat, and heat your home, you still have real inflation, and this is way, way above the Fed's 2% target, and it's a serious, serious problem. So that's one of the biggest reasons you're seeing the 10-year yield as high as you are, is not because Donald Trump is going to be massively inflationary with tariffs. We already had this before. There's a lot to do with this that people just don't want to admit. Beef prices are out of control. We went from under $4 a pound pre-COVID to almost $6 a pound now. This is pricing people out of eating. And this is so, so serious. So this is really where, and I talk about, people don't realize about the inflation and the economy, and really part of why Trump got elected, it's because of the economy, and it's because people cannot afford to go to the grocery store, and they can't afford to eat healthy, like with chicken and beef, which is huge. Okay, switching back globally, German auto manufacturing is in a very bad spot. So is all auto manufacturing in Europe, but German auto manufacturing is running at half the capacity. So I told you they're getting inundated with these cheap cars from China, and they can't also export cars. So you can see German auto production, their car production is down significantly. Now, Germany and Europe are also faced with very high electricity prices. So that chart on the left shows you with taxes, they're like over 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, Germany is also the die on the hill, for the energy transition. So if you want to know a country that is more hell-bent on the energy transition, and that's why I say it's not a transition. Energy transition equates to declining economy. If I'm willing to suffer a low economy and I'm willing to not grow, I can have the energy transition, and that is what Germany is doing. That is their power generation by fuel. You can see that the outright total power generation is on an outright decline, and this is a bad, bad grid. I have high electricity prices, I'm declining my grid, so I don't have the power generation for when people need it. So if and when World War III happens, or if and when we need Germany to step up to the plate and maybe produce ammunitions or something, they're not going to be able to do it because they can't make things. You do not manufacture things with that big green chunk there, which is that wind and solar that they've added. So they've done everything you shouldn't do. Take down your coal, take down all your reliable power, and add a bunch of wind and solar. Now you have very, very expensive energy, and you have very unreliable and unaffordable energy. Just a recipe for failure. And you are seeing this in the politics within Germany today and within their economy. They're just getting ripped right now. Volkswagen, unprecedented. I can't underscore this enough. We are kind of harkening back to World War II here, just from comparison sakes of where we've been at. Volkswagen was a bulwark in World War II for Germany. They've never closed a plant. Now they're closing 3 plants. They're doing a 10% pay cut across the board, and they're cutting tens of thousands of jobs. This has never happened. And that is because it's like $60 an hour for pay in Germany. In Eastern Europe, it's roughly like $16 an hour. And then if you go to other countries in Asia, it's significantly cheaper. But I can't underscore this enough, that this is the heart of the German auto industry, but this is also like your industrial heartland of Europe. And we forget that Europe is an industrial, was an industrial powerhouse. And energy, access to affordable energy, access to plentiful energy matters to make things. And it is undercutting and just decimating Germany. So it is what we need to not do. And thank God we won't have that. We're probably not going to have that because we have a change of administration who wants to embrace energy. Chinese cement output and steel production. You have to take every Chinese data point, not just with a grain of salt, but with like sandbags of salt, because nothing's reliable. But I spend a lot of time looking at China, so I look at a lot of data points. So I selected these just to point out these have probably been massaged, so they're probably worse than this. So I know that if my cement output is down and my steel production is not good, that I'm probably not increasing my oil consumption at 2 million barrels a day when I have COVID shut-ins and I've shut Shanghai down for 2 months and no one's driving. The math just doesn't work. That's their passenger car exports and their EV exports in China. They're just dumping ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, and EVs onto the market, absolutely dumping. It's both desperation and genius. Because they desperately need it because their economy's tanking, they're trying to stay afloat, but also they're hurting manufacturing. So what better to kick somebody when they're down like Germany, because they're not going to have to, if they can keep kicking Germany down now, they do not have to compete with Germany later. And that is something, and China does think way more long-term than folks realize, so they're definitely doing that. So kick the German auto manufacturers out of the business and you won't have to compete with them later. So yeah, you're hurting now for China, but it helps if you keep doing this. And Germany's just helping them by pushing through this energy transition and trying to do it and increasing these costs. And as Germany has done this and they took all that coal out of their grid, they basically just moved all that manufacturing to China. So they not only moved the manufacturing to China and they took the jobs, then they dumped the vehicles onto them, and so they just got triple hurt. Tourist arrivals in China, that's another good data point. Again, why I don't believe in the 17 million barrels a day demand, because tourist arrivals have barely come back in China. So this is a really great chart, a nerdy chart, a PetroNerd nerdy chart. This is oil consumption in China, so that's that green line. This is that massive uptick I'm talking about, where they just, during COVID lockdowns, they just rapidly increase oil demand. Not real, that's fiction. But on paper, that's what the market's kind of struggling with here, is that, oh, they're demanding this. Even the IEA, OPEC, they all say they're demanding this. No, they're not. They just not, because that's the oil production, that bottom green line you see there, that darker line. They're producing probably right now about 4.5 million barrels per day. And so that big gap is what they're importing. And they are importing that. But that purple line is their GDP annual growth. Now, it's nowhere near what it says, which is about 4%. But we know it's on a downward trajectory. So let's just say, I'll be gracious and I'll say it's 2%, which it's probably not. It's probably not even 1%. But let's just say it's there. No way can their GDP be declining like that and oil demand be going up at the same rate. So there's a disconnect, which means they're stockpiling a lot. And that stockpiling, that should make you concerned about prepping and all kinds of things that they're doing, just to think about intelligently and analytically, but also from an oil market standpoint, it does matter, because what we're seeing, and don't share this because I wasn't supposed to share this, but this is IEA's chart of where we're at for crude oil and product. And so you can see on crude oil stockpiles globally, crude oil has come down. And so if you are one of the bulls, and there's a lot of folks in the oil industry in the past 2 years have been very bullish on the macro and very bullish on oil prices, they look at this and they say, okay, well, stocks are down. Well, stocks are down, but product is up. So that's a problem. And so if I'm refining a lot of product, if I'm running my throughput in my refineries and I have a lot of product, that eventually weighs on the market, and you're definitely seeing that right now for prices. I only put this in here. This is from the IEA, from their recent report that came out. And they're doing something that I think we have to be careful about, and they're conflating they say rapid deployment of clean energy transport technologies is also tempering consumption growth. And they're talking about China. I think we have to be careful with that. That's true to a degree in China, that China is rapidly pushing electric vehicles into their grid, using coal and EVs and pushing into their grid. But you can't extrapolate that for the entire world, that this EV deployment we're transitioning, and it's also not healthy. So I think what China is really doing is they're trying to insulate, obviously, from crude oil imports, but we have to be very careful just saying that it's not outright economic decline, and that's what the IEA is not saying. It is outright economic decline in China, in addition to they're pushing the EVs. So now we can get into this. Okay, so we have a lot of spare capacity on the market. So this is just a very nerdy chart of your annual surplus capacity in OPEC. A lot of that is coming from Saudi Arabia, and then oil prices. And you can see for 2024, actually, war has definitely helped hold up
oil prices because we have a lot of spare capacity on the market. So if you're thinking why, we have all these wars, why don't we have high oil? It's because Saudi Arabia is producing under 9 million barrels per day. We know that they can easily produce 12 million barrels per day. So we have a few million barrels a day alone of just spare capacity in Saudi Arabia, and we have more in other countries as well. So the war in Ukraine looks like this. We'll spend a minute on this just for a second, and that's because of everything going on right now. There's a lot of talk of, obviously, Trump campaigned on this as well. This war in Ukraine is 3 years on. That's what the map looked like on day one. So all those red things where Russia comes into Ukraine, it's very bad. What Russia has done in Ukraine is horrible. It's not good. But they're putting all the chips on the table now. Everybody's putting chips on the table. So North Korea entering the war, that's chips on the table. Chips, Biden giving Ukraine using our missiles, or using our weapons, chips on the table. Saudi Arabia calling out genocide in Hamas, chips on the table. Everybody wants a bunch of chips because they all know they're going to have to negotiate with Trump, and they want some chips. So that map in the middle is where we look right now, right? That's Crimea at the bottom, which Russia took in 2014. Nobody did anything about that. I was not happy about that, but the world just was like, oh, cool, you just go take that warm water port and everything, no big deal. So we just let them take that. Now they've got this whole edge where they've really consolidated. So negotiation is probably going to look something like, hey, Russia, what will you take? Crimea, obviously, and then parts of this Donbass or something where they take this. Ukraine's not going to like it, but I do think the people in Ukraine, if we were to ask leadership versus the people, the reason Ukraine at the end of, a couple months ago entered Russia was because they were looking for chips on the table as well, right? They were hoping that they could get Russia to the negotiating seat, and they really needed to get morale to the people of Ukraine, the folks fighting the war. I mean, this is an ongoing war for years, and people are dying, and they need that moral support and that just oomph, and they got it. But then what happened was they sent their best troops into Russia, and then Russia was like, cool, we don't need to be there. They took their troops, they just went around and they went back into Ukraine. This is a very long ongoing war. We can continue to give them weapons, but it won't end it. And Russia, you just don't underestimate the ability to them to keep going on and on and on. They have no interest in ending this, and China has absolutely no interest in Russia ending this because China's benefiting massively from getting all their crude, from getting all of this and keeping everybody occupied. And then China might want to go do something in Taiwan or just do something in South China Sea or just be more aggressive somewhere else, and everyone will be occupied here. And then North Korea entered the war just recently. That's more chips again. And North Korea is interested in actually getting military, they want their troops to have experience. They have not fought a war since the 50s. So they would like to see what this is actually like. And everybody is gaining a lot of intelligence from this. So I told you Russia-China trade. There's a lot of trade between Russia and China on paper. We know there's a lot more than this. These attacks within the Red Sea, I just Googled this last night just to prove the point. You don't hear about this on the news, but these attacks within the Red Sea are huge. And something the Federal Reserve has actually mentioned over the course of this year, they were seeing a disinflation on goods pricing. We have seen reinflation on goods pricing, and part of it's because of this, is because if you are trying to go through the Red Sea and go into Europe, you can't. If you're an American vessel, if you're a European vessel, if you've helped out Israel, you can't move a ship in through here, and you get attacked by the Houthis, who are getting money from Iran, who are Iran-backed, and they are, and that's money's coming from China. So this is something that is going to be very important to deal with, and the Trump administration will have to deal with this. I do think saying we'll take this seriously and getting more folks from Europe to help us out with this is huge. And then we're going to have to do some finagling with Saudi Arabia. Again, that's why they're putting some chips on the table, calling this genocide just because they want some leverage. They like to play everybody off each other. That's Russian oil production. You can see that it has barely taken a breather since this war in Ukraine. So again, don't underestimate the Russian capacity to be very, very resilient. And they have been exceptionally resilient. They have a very simple economy that has held up much better than people expected. The fact that the Biden administration continues to put sanctions on Russia means that we didn't put all the sanctions on in the first place. So they haven't worked, but clearly we didn't use all of them. And their exports, Russian exports, are holding up really, really well despite this war in Ukraine. The discount to Brent is barely existent right now. It was bigger, obviously, when prices are higher, but it's eroded significantly, so they're getting plenty of money. That's just China and India gold reserves. Partly why gold prices are going up, but something to be, everybody's trying to just kind of get more comfortable, this is inflation, but there's a lot of other things, and China is definitely trying to decouple and insulate. These are Iranian crude oil exports, and that's Chinese demand on the right. So we know it's over 2 million barrels a day that Iran's exporting, but you can just see on paper where the Trump administration, when we enforced these sanctions where we were, all we have to do is enforce them. All we have to do is just say, you aren't allowed to move this crude to China. We did that before, we reduced it, and then they went off to the races because the Biden administration from day one has been wanting to do a deal with Iran, and they just haven't been able to do it because every time they get close, the hardliners go and do something really bad. And the hardliners in Iran do not want to do a deal. They would like this war to keep on going, and they're going to keep it going. So something you can probably expect from a Trump administration is really just kind of allow Israel to push back. And you may agree or disagree with that, but allowing Israel just more flexibility to push back, it will kind of hold them in check. And I do think it is probably more stabilizing for the Middle East than people realize. Now, that's OPEC production, that you can nerd out with that later, but OPEC production, just total OPEC production, is 26.5 million barrels per day. So they've increased output a little bit over the past month. That was largely Libya, but OPEC production we are producing half of OPEC production. So if we're 13.5 million barrels per day and OPEC is 26.5, we're producing half of OPEC production. That chart on the right is US, Saudi, and Russian exports. We are exporting way more crude and product than our largest peers, Saudi Arabia and Russia, massively. So we are the largest exporter in the world by a wide margin. That's our total crude and product, about almost 11 million barrels per day. That's crude, that's refined product, and that's your natural gas liquids. We also export a ton of propane, almost 2 million barrels a day, almost 2 million barrels a day of diesel, a lot of gasoline as well. Okay, we're gonna go through this fast, and then I'm gonna close on US shale. So total volumes of global LNG, I told you 53 BCF a day. That red line is the chunk that goes to China. That purple line is what actually goes to Europe. So again, Ursula von der Leyen coming out and saying, hey, Trump, I'm really willing to take more LNG. That's great. That's really good for Europe because that creates, and it's good for our market as well. But the point here is that that's 53 BCF a day. That is out of a 400 billion cubic feet per day market. So it's still a new and nascent market that still really needs to be developed. And so it's not like crude where we have it completely developed. We need the redundancy in the system. And building out infrastructure in the US is a big, big way to help that. So that's our current exports right now. That pipeline is your yellow, and that red line is your LNG exports, and those are the corresponding prices. So we're between 12 and 14 BCF a day right now, and our prices are about $6 an MCF. So even the exports are pretty low and are just rock bottom low, as you know, $1.28 for pipeline exports for natural gas. So the role of coal, I can't emphasize this enough, in natural gas prices. Now you can see natural gas prices and production on the right. I emphasize this because we are producing so much natural gas, 125 billion cubic feet per day, and we have these very low prices. The US consumer should have seen deflation in their electricity prices, like absolute outright, they should have seen it. Just like when you go to the pump, you feel inflation for oil prices. You see the sticker shock when you go to the gasoline pump and oil prices are 80 and gasoline prices are high, but you also feel deflation. Prices go down and you see lower prices at the pump. That is not happening with electricity prices and particularly natural gas prices. But the role of coal, you can see coal prices are flat. They're $2 to $3 an MMBTU. That is really, really important if we want to add more natural gas into the grid, because when we do have price variability on natural gas, we can just kind of lean on that coal. And what's happened is as we pulled coal out of the system, we've seen those spikes. So this is electricity prices. Cannot emphasize this and bang this home enough. Really, really hope that this administration, Chris Wright and team and everyone focuses on this a lot, is that we've increased electricity prices from this flat 13 cents a kilowatt hour to 18 cents a kilowatt hour in 3.5 years. Just this dramatic increase in prices. And that is for a couple of reasons. This is our power generation by fuel. So that black line is coal, that yellow line is natural gas. Your stable, conventional, and nuclear are gray, and hydropower is blue. And then wind and solar I've added together, and that's green. So what you see here is, yes, we've added natural gas. That's half of our grid. So again, you should see lower prices, but you're not. We've decommissioned coal like crazy, and we've added a bunch of wind and solar. So is it the addition of wind and solar? Is it the adding of natural gas? Or is it decommissioning coal? And the answer is it's a couple of those. And you can see the corresponding rise in price. So here's your wind and solar additions on your left and your rise in price. So yes, you add a bunch of wind and solar into the grid, you lose that dispatchable baseload power generation. So when we take out the coal that you see on the right of how aggressively we've decommissioned that coal, you're taking out that cheap, reliable, baseload dispatchable power. And that is, and adding this crappy, expensive, non-dispatchable power into the grid, so you're gonna get higher costs. This came from a JP Morgan report. I can't emphasize it enough. There's a direct correlation between adding wind and solar power generation into your grid and higher electricity prices. It's happened in Europe, it's happening in the US, like direct correlation. This stuff is not cheap, nor is it good forms of energy. I emphasize this a lot, but wind power is 1,000 times, the power density of wind is 1,000 times less than natural gas. In Colorado, you have companies like Xcel and utility providers that are passing on rate increases for natural gas and electricity to pay for the renewables, to decommission the coal. And so you're not seeing that deflation on natural gas, and natural gas prices are getting just ratcheted up higher. So this chart really makes me angry and upset for the consumer, because this is your electricity prices. You can see in red and the nice uptick there that we talked about. And that's your natural gas prices in green that you guys know. It's about $2 an MCF. And then your prices, and this should make you very angry, the average residential price for natural gas people are paying is $23 an MMBTU. And I promise I'm hurrying. Okay, that's your correlation with electricity prices in Colorado and wind and solar. So that blue line is your percentage of, your blue line is electricity prices. That red line, see how nice tightly correlated this? That is your wind and solar into the grid. So tightly correlated that when it goes down, the prices go down with it. And that is your grid in Colorado, which looks a lot like Germany, which is not great. That's our CO2 emissions in the US. You can see they go down in the US in about 2006, and that correlates with when we were really ramping up natural gas and we were decommissioning coal. So globally, global power generation by fuel, that is 30,000 terawatt hours global. That's our total power generation. We're talking about this because we're talking about AI, we're talking about your business, we're talking about nat gas. That black line there is, the black chunk is coal, then we have natural gas. World coal production and consumption, your consumption is your orange line, that's global coal consumption, and then that's Chinese coal consumption. Chinese coal consumption is more than half of global coal consumption. We are at record highs for coal consumption in the world. If you think about emissions, just CO2 emissions, again, I don't think it's the biggest thing we should be worried about, but if you just want to look, for the OECD or the developed world, it is down and declining, and for the non-OECD or the developing world, it's one trajectory and that's up. I'm not necessarily blaming that, I'm just saying it's a reality, it's growing. Global oil production and consumption, that's what it looks like, kind of regardless of price. We're there, that 100 million barrels a day demand. I told you natural gas production and consumption, it's a 400 billion cubic feet per day market. This can continue to grow, will continue to grow. If you break out natural gas consumption by the developed world and the developing world, natural gas consumption is growing everywhere in the developing world and the developed world, and has a lot of running room, but we have to build the LNG infrastructure to do that, particularly in the US. AI demand, everyone references this. This is probably the study you hear, that 1,000 terawatt hours. Just to put in perspective, 1,000 terawatt hours is Japan's grid. And so Goldman Sachs put this out here and said we're going to have this 1,000 terawatt hours of demand just coming from AI alone. The US is probably about 40% of that. So we have to add power generation. So when I was showing you Germany's power generation, you can't have this unless you're adding to the grid. So we have to be adding to the grid. Now, our primary energy consumption globally is still about 82% oil, natural gas, and coal. That makes sense from all the data I showed you. So only about 8.2% is wind, solar, and biomass. If you look at China versus the US, really, really important, again, not just because when we're thinking about oil, the oil chunk is in green, so that's just your percentage of primary energy consumption. And the reason I point this out is because the US looks a lot like the rest of the world, where we have a lot of oil, we have a decent amount of oil consumption, and so does Europe, so does most countries, where we drive and we fuel our economies with oil. In China, not only is that black is coal, and it's over half, but the entire thing is only less than 20% is transportation or is road fuels from oil. So almost all their primary energy consumption, a good 80% of it, is not oil, which means they have the capacity to make things. They have the capacity to build things. And yes, they're building wind turbines and solar panels and everything, but they have the capacity to actually make other things that they're giving to Russia, like ammunition and weapons and technology and tanks, and probably things that they will be using themselves if they decide to ever use them in combat. So Chinese power generation, can't emphasize this enough, you cannot we're not adding. So this is US. That's our power generation on the right. It's 4,500 terawatt hours. We've really taken out the coal. We've added the natural gas, so we're adding renewables. We have about as much wind and solar as China does, actually. So when you hear people bragging about China, China's adding the wind and solar, but they're adding it with coal. So they have 9,500 terawatt hours of power generation. They have 1/3 of the world's power generation. That should just be concerning for everyone just because they have 1/3 of the world's power generation. What do they want to do with it? Well, they want to make stuff, clearly, and they are making stuff and they're dumping it everywhere, but 5,700 terawatt hours of that is coal-fired power generation. So if you were battling a game of CO2 emissions, you aren't winning. Like you're not winning at all, and every time you decommission a coal-fired power plant in the US or in Europe, you're just adding it in China and you're just giving them that leverage, which they're happy to take. CO2 emissions in China are just off into the races, almost 13,000 million tons. US CO2 emissions are at 1990 levels and declining. Globally, that's what it looks like. They're more than a quarter of global CO2 emissions. And lastly, and I will close on this, and I know I'm probably over, even though we're a little over in time, but okay, US oil production, that's oil production, that's gas production, just an incredible, amazing story to stare at that chart because we were, just in 2008, we were less than 5 million barrels per day. So when you think of the leverage of this administration to leverage going from that, our growth in this and what we can do globally, it is really significant. It's also important to realize that that growth really kind of does happen regardless of price. And I know everybody wants healthy prices, but we can still grow production north of $60 a barrel. We could probably still grow production north of 50. We did. We had much lower prices. We still grew production. We weren't as profitable as an industry. That's very true. But right now, margins are very good, and I think we have to be very creative about this threshold. We also need to be better about focusing on getting more out of production after we've drilled and completed the wells. Natural gas production and prices, I've showed you this already. That's just stacked up where that production is coming from. Obviously, a lot of it is coming from Texas and New Mexico. It is amazing to think that Texas and New Mexico, 2 counties in New Mexico, Leonetti County, are producing over 2 million barrels per day. And that together, Texas and New Mexico are producing almost as much crude as Saudi Arabia. I mean, that is mind-blowing and just really, really impressive. And if you look at actually, New Mexico production does produce higher regardless of price, absolutely regardless of price. California and Alaska, this is your story of what not to do. They are on a terminal decline for oil production. Colorado is flat-ish, about 450,000 barrels a day, because we have a very, very harsh regulatory environment where it's very difficult to get permits. I think when we think about drill, baby, drill, and frack, 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 and what does this actually mean for the industry, and again, I promise I'm almost done here, it really means that we will probably have lower prices if we increase oil and gas production. Can we increase oil and gas production? We definitely can. We can actually increase oil and gas production. But I really want to leave you with a couple thoughts of that. NGL prices are tied to oil prices. So even if I dropped my oil prices a little bit, I'm still going to have higher NGL prices. And if I can up my natural gas prices a little bit, that's super beneficial. So that means that companies start stepping out into gassier areas. That means they find some condensates, they find some NGLs, and that's all beneficial. And I think that is very, very important for the life cycle of these plays and thinking about the next iteration and M&A, what happens with privates. Here's Rockies production. When I throw in Oklahoma, you get to this 2.5 million barrels per day. Thinking about federal land, thinking about where we could see growth, especially under a Trump administration and that drill baby drill mantra, it is more private companies. It's more giving leasehold. It's Wyoming. It's places like the Rockies where you can incentivize companies outside of the Permian. Love the Permian to death. You guys are amazing. But there's still a lot of oil in the ground other places. That's the U.S. rig count lateral length. This is a money chart. Super simple. You all know this. But very important to realize is that I don't think the world realizes this. That is your average lateral length in red. So it incrementally has risen on average to every well is about 2 miles long. And then we've dropped 200 rigs in 2 years. So we're producing 13.5 million barrels per day with less than 600 rigs, which is 200 less than when we came back from COVID, which is way less than what we had before. So we are drilling longer wells, significantly longer wells. That's, again, your US average lateral length. And you can see where the public and private operators are at. The public operators are in orange. They're very cored up. That's where they're drilling now. The private companies are in purple, and they step out. And I think this is so important to think about when you think about what do slightly higher natural gas prices mean? What is a deregulation or less regulation, less onerous regulation, the ability to drill and produce oil and gas? That's very beneficial for stepping out a little bit and de-risking and then allowing bigger companies to come in there. So hugely beneficial on the private sector. And then we think about, okay, we've stepped out, the private stepped out, we had all this natural gas production in 2022 and everything. But shouldn't we see, if we have longer laterals, 4-mile long laterals in the Permian, shouldn't we see diminishing returns, especially in that lateral? And when you put every single oil basin, Anadarko, Permian, DJ, Powder, all of them, and you normalize the lateral length, you are not smashing that decline curve. You're actually holding up the decline curve for 2023 and 2024. You're drilling less wells. And I know all this data computes because I'm producing 13.5 million barrels per day, and I'm doing it with less wells and less rigs and longer laterals, which means I'm holding that up. And I think the tail of that, I think the ability to make sure that we're producing, 2 years from now from that 4-mile long lateral, that's huge. That means I'm probably going to increase my output from that in the future because I'll be better at completing that toe of that rock. Natural gas, that's that dotted line up there is 2022. So when we have higher natural gas prices, we go after it. That is the highest natural gas prices we've seen since the shale revolution was in 2022. And we had people wildcatting for natural gas wells, stepping out. We had oil companies, these are again oil basins, going after oil or going after gas, driving the oil up, bringing up with the oil, but really going after natural gas and seeing those returns. So can't underscore and emphasize that enough on nat gas. And then this is just your public-private rig count. We're kind of in line for the US right now, but I think the role of activity by private operators, you cannot underscore enough that it might not be half the production, but it's definitely half the activity. That's what it looks like in the Permian. So again, you have a lot of privates here. Horizontal completions, again, promise, almost done, folks. That's just stacked horizontal well completion. So those lines show you all the wells we have in the US, pre-COVID, post-COVID. Not completing as many wells, not bringing as many wells online into production. Yet we are producing more oil. That green line is oil prices, and those are your rig counts. So we're not adding as many. So when we look at, if you break that for public and private, privates came back. Private operators respond to oil prices. They've actually held up really well. The rig count has declined, but completions have still kind of hung in there. And then publics have not come back. This is your ESG pressure, your investor pressure, which again, we could take some of that ESG and investor pressure off. Not every company is going to do it, but I do think some will be more comfortable, even probably in a less higher oil price environment, just ability to produce. That's your Permian public-private rig count, and you can see where privates really came off to the races. Obviously, we've had a lot of consolidation. And then that's Permian Basin stacked, where private companies came back, public companies came back, and you're actually bringing on more wells now than we were. And you can just see it. It's an amazing, incredible story where you have more private operator activity than you had pre-COVID. And this is something the entire market got wrong. Private equity got it wrong. Everyone got this wrong. They said privates were going to decline and be done for, and that did not happen because the market shifted. And that's why I just really want to emphasize market headwinds and tailwinds matter a great deal. And there's a market shift that happened under Biden, and there's a massive market shift that's about to take place under Trump. That's your private wells, and that's your public wells just in the Permian. You can see how clear that is night and day post-COVID with privates, which was just incredible. That's your average lateral length for the Permian. You're looking at 4-mile long laterals and average over 12,000 foot in Midland. And with that, I'm going to close, and I thank you guys so much. You've been an awesome audience. Thank you.